Hello, I'm Professor Movie-Maestro. I might not be qualified to be teaching you about film, but let's give it a chance, shall we? Today's featured film is a sight to behold: a crazed scientist, a squandered love triangle, a performance worthy of all the Academy Awards, which are worthless anyway, and a madman with a penchant for bathrobes. It's 1933's The Invisible Man. Also, yes, Timmy, I see you raising your hand in the back of the class. No, this is not the 2020 Elizabeth Moss movie. Elizabeth Moss cannot be seen in this film. Now then, welcome to class. Shut up, sit down, get ready to learn.
Professor Movie-Maestro.
The Invisible Man, directed by James Whale, written by R.C. Sheriff, Philip Wiley, and Preston Sturgis, is a horror film based on H.G. Wells' eponymous novel starring Claude Rains as the transparent tyrannical terror. It follows a crazed man searching for a cure to his newfound despicable disfigurement. In late 1931, Universal Pictures was interested in the story as a follow-up to Dracula and Frankenstein. Universal bought the rights to The Invisible Man, written by H.G. Wells, for $10,000, with the stipulation that Wells had script approval. 2 years before Wells' book was published, X-rays were introduced to the world, leading many to consider the ability to see through a human body. Despite invisibility granting magical items scattered throughout historical mythology, H.G. Wells was one of the first storytellers to consider the gift, or curse, of invisibility attained through science. While titled after and largely based on H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man, the film actually has a second source material that it pulls from: Philip Wiley's The Murderer Invisible, published in 1931. This book was quite different than Wells', as Wiley's tale included an invisible octopus and invisible rats spreading an invisible bubonic plague through a visible city, world, or whatever invisible rats spread bubonic plagues through. It seemed that Universal had bought the rights to H.G. Wells' novel simply for the infamous author's name. The studio amassed numerous failed attempts for an Invisible Man script by almost every writer Universal had on hand. All of the treatments strayed further and further from the original novel, ignoring the tenets of what made Wells' work effective. 12 different scripts were written before R.C. Sheriff's script was accepted by all, including H.G. Wells. R.C. Sheriff, Robert Cedric Sheriff, intended for his draft to be more faithful to H.G. Wells' story, only incorporating a few elements from The Murderer Invisible to help provide a humanity to Wells' protagonist Jack Griffin. Note for future screenwriters: it is said that Sheriff saw screenwriting as a mix between writing a play and a novel. He explained it was a screenwriter's job to not pursue alternative paths from the novel. He would visualize a script as being a faithful play adaptation without the limitation of sets and locations restricted by the size of an immovable stage. The inclusions from Wiley's The Murderer Invisible structured the film adaptation of Wells' The Invisible Man in a manner that paralleled director James Whale's previous smash hit from 1931, Frankenstein. After the success of Frankenstein, Whale would direct The Invisible Man and The Bride of Frankenstein, released in 1935. Whale's direction, stemming from his stage career, clearly influenced the powerful performances of each film's main character and helped establish the Universal monsters as bold forces to be reckoned with. The film starts as Dr. Jack Griffin, the Invisible Man, walks into an inn with his iconic bandage head. Griffin's introduction is one of many parallels to Whale's Frankenstein, as the Invisible Man is introduced by 3 successive shots, pulling the audience reluctantly closer to the bandaged stranger, similar to when Whale first introduced audiences to the monster in 1931's Frankenstein. It created a sense of uneasiness in the audience, as the audience is forced to confront this unknown figure. Una O'Connor plays the co-inn owner, or inn owner's wife, Mrs. Hall, and she does a terrific job of just being the most annoying person ever. I mean no disrespect to Mrs. O'Connor. Her performance is great and it makes me smile and laugh every time, but Mrs. Hall is just one of the most annoying characters in this film.
He's here! The Invisible Man!
Please don't. Shut up.
There's a quick time jump, and Griffin's overstayed his welcome. He hasn't paid his rent, and the owners are getting restless. Mrs. Hall sends her husband upstairs to kick Griffin out, and he finds Griffin with a homemade laboratory in his room. Griffin gets upset and pushes Mr. Hall down the stairs. Mrs. Hall calls the cops, and here we are introduced to the absolutely amazing E.E. Clive as Constable Jaffers. His face in every scene is priceless. This man does not give a flying squirrel about anything.
Put the handcuffs on. Reckon I handcuff a blooming shirt.
Like he's told about an invisible man, and he just doesn't care. It's like it happens every day to him. It's fantastic. While both Una O'Connor and E.E. Clive appear in James Whale's 1935 film The Bride of Frankenstein, I would have loved to have seen E.E. Clive cast in every Universal monster film. He could be like the Nick Fury, tie each film together and say, "We need you for the Monster Initiative." I almost want Constable Jaffers to be a needed member on the Monster Initiative team, like you have Frankenstein's Monster, the Wolfman, the Bride of Frankenstein, Invisible Man, and Constable Jaffers. And he's just like, typical Tuesday. Griffin strips to evade Constable Jaffers and a few of the bar patrons. I don't know about these guys, but as this invisible man is stripping in front of me, I'm double thinking my attack strategy. I'm just thinking, how close is Griffin? Plus, that's gotta be super chilly, especially in the finale, but we'll get to that. Griffin escapes his attackers and runs through the streets with nothing on, disturbing people, laughing maniacally, and engaging in a general amount of mayhem. Add taking Instagram photos and you have Coachella. Griffin's sudden shift to insanity seems out of place with regard to his character arc. In every story, the protagonist, whether they are good or bad, must have a want and a need according to basic screenwriting rules. Usually, you want to know your protagonist within the first 10 pages or 10 minutes of screen time. To begin with, Griffin wants to reverse the invisibility process. Great want. Experiment's gone awry, he wants to be normal again. But then he goes on a rampage without any provocation aside from Mrs. Hall's husband barging in, and then it's off the rails. I was distracted by thinking about riding a bike naked. Ouch! Bike seats are bad enough. It's hard to find one that is at least mildly comfortable, but barebacking a bicycle? That action alone defines Jack Griffin as a madman or a masochist. Anyway, this whole hubbub with the popo leads Griffin to reach out to his old associate, Dr. Kemp, played by William Harrigan. Dr. Kemp works with Dr. Cranley, Griffin's mentor and father to Griffin's love interest, Flora, played by Gloria Stewart, who can also be seen in two other films by director James Whale, The Old Dark House in 1932 and The Kiss Before the Mirror in 1933. Also, she's Granny Rose in James Cameron's Titanic. Griffin finds Kemp at his estate and attempts to enlist his help in taking over the world. After Griffin retires for the night, Dr. Kemp calls Dr. Cranley for help, and Flora insists on coming along. At first, I thought this was a very one-sided affair. There's an establishing scene where Flora is worried that Griffin is in trouble as he hasn't wrote to her. The audience has only seen Griffin give Mrs. Hall emphatic instructions and attempt to cure his disfigurement. When Flora gets out of the car with Dr. Cranley, that's when it struck me.
Flora? Why, yes, of course.
She was his need. At first, Griffin's want was to become visible again, then it was to cause chaos and sell his findings to the highest bidder for an army of invisible warriors. Ooh, I'd watch that. The Invisible Army. It was actually heart-touching to see Griffin become a little self-conscious when he saw Flora arrive. This is one of the few moments we hear Rains change his voice to reveal what we can only assume is the real Jack Griffin.
I shall go and prepare myself in my room. I shall see Flora.
We realize the serum is affecting his mind, and he had began to forget their
How
relationship.
could I forget?
This is even more endearing when we learn that his whole reason for creating the serum was to sell it in order to provide for Flora.
I want to help you. Why did you do this?
For you, Flora, I was so pitifully poor. I had nothing to offer you, Flora.
His double-sided want to return to normal and to provide for Flora is a direct result of his love for her, which he needs to realize doesn't require money or power. She already loves him, and even now doesn't even mind if he's disfigured or invisible, as she's talking to a walking bandage head. Pop quiz. Would you think an invisible person is attractive? Do you need to see them to be attracted to them? Joaquin Phoenix and her would say no. At this point, the police try catching Griffin numerous times. I really liked seeing the various attempts at catching the Invisible Man. The scene where all the townsfolk call in and give various methods to catch the unseen menace was actually pretty fun. Also, when all of these orphans are supposed to look scared or in terror, this kid looks like he'd shank the Invisible Man. The man in the cabin with his wife just happens to keep a bat beside his chair, ready to inflict some vigilante justice. Yep, honey. I hear one of those darn blasted invisible hooligans are running loose again. Put dinner on. I'll be back before dark. But it is dark. Shh. 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 Don't you worry about that. Also, I love when the cops drag a net across the room, and then they all sit on the floor cross-legged, except for this guy. He gets a chair. Why couldn't they all have chairs? While not entirely lighthearted, there were moments of actual fun and ingenuity in the film. Canvassing the house with a net was pretty good. Pouring oil to stick to the Invisible Man was a great idea, not unlike the paint in the 2020 film. But the best idea was the finale, a winter snowstorm. We'll get to that later. Again, what helps films like this is that the writers thought the script through. Using the literary tool we call Chekhov's gun, one of the patrons mentions footsteps in the phone call montage, and it returns later in the finale. But again, we'll get to that. As I was watching this, I really felt like this could not be made today. There wasn't enough action or blood, but there was actual care and thought put into how could you catch an invisible man? The writers tried to craft a thoughtful tale. They didn't cheap out and write a senseless story. It had some foundation of reality with a nuanced message. Just like Griffin's want and need. We didn't have the whole picture early on. Perhaps the writers, Sheriff and Sturgis, held off a little long on establishing Griffin's true want and need, but it still functions pretty well. I wasn't unsatisfied, as I have been so many times with recent pictures. This film had a solid foundation, and I left the screening feeling like I had seen a complete story, and pretty much every question I had was answered. However, I will point out that there is not a clearly defined hero in this story. Well, I mean, Constable Jaffers is of course the real hero, in our hearts. But there's no one person we root for or feel a connection to. Within the first 10 pages of a script, or again, the first 10 minutes of the film, is usually a save the cat moment, a scene where the protagonist, no matter how unlikable he or she is, saves a pet or helps a child and endears audiences to the main character. Instead, Sheriff opted to include a love interest as our sole connection to Griffin's humanity. Griffin's want changes, but his need was forgotten within the narrative and is only later recalled in the film when he reunites with Flora and reveals his original intentions. Talking about thought put into the script, how about the last of Griffin's victims in the town rampage? He had a purpose. It wasn't a random throwaway character. He found Griffin sleeping in his barn and led the police to him. They smoke him out and watch Griffin's footsteps leading out of the barn in the snow before shooting him dead. It is hilarious how often Griffin needed to be naked to enact his plans. Yes, the amount of sheer nudity in this film should have given it an R rating at least. You'd think Griffin might cut his feet or legs on the ground or scaling objects, and somebody would see something. I appreciated when Griffin mentioned people might see him if dirt gets on his feet, or if he ate something that his intestines would show. I don't know how he kept his feet clean, but the wind and temperature would be his greatest weakness, I think. I still don't know how he slept naked in a pile of hay.
This feels
Ow!
good.
A few final things to wrap up. How was The Invisible Man made? Well, Invisible Mommy and Invisible Daddy loved each other and... Oh, the film process? For scenes where Claude Rains was taking off the bandages or unveiling himself, he was dressed in a black velvet suit against a black backdrop. They would then superimpose this onto the existing background shot. As for the floating objects, simple wires or string. Sheriff and Whale made sure every scene with the invisible Jack Griffin had him doing something physical for the audience to know exactly where he was positioned, refraining from using only a disembodied voice to indicate his presence. Fun fact, when Griffin prepares to lie down for bed, the back of his collar is gone. I chuckled to myself as that's one of those things that makes the technique apparent, but nonetheless, it remains impressive for the time. Students, you need to understand that we don't criticize saying that we could do it better. Sure, it would be a fun production experiment, but this was 1933. Even if the film was produced by today's filmmakers, the best way to study the craft is to learn what works and what doesn't. While this technique was effective, there are areas where the special effects crew, or tricks department as they were called back then, could have been a little bit more vigilant. As much as James Whale should be recognized for his contributions to the Universal Monsters films, John Fulton, the head of the trick department, aka the Doctor, as he was known around the Universal lot, should be recognized for his creation of the Invisible Man's special effects, along with Al Johnson and Bob Laszlo. I should also mention the half wall. Yes, the half wall. The fantastic half wall. When we first meet Kemp and Flora, Flora exits to another room. Kemp follows, and we learn that he is in love with her, which is never mentioned after this scene except the fact that he keeps a framed portrait on his fireplace mantle, which Griffin either never sees or acknowledges. He's just like, "Yup, my friend and work colleague likes my girlfriend and has a framed photo of her." Is that weird? We also had a neat little love triangle involving Flora, and then it was like, nope, never happened. Flora and Kemp walk through this door in a wall, not a door that allows access to another room, but a wall in the middle of this giant open space that has a door for some reason and doesn't connect to anything else. He could have just walked around it, but who knows, it might be structurally integral to the building. Without that 2/3 of a wall, the entire building might have fallen down. You know, I should build a partial wall with a door in my future house. That'd be dope. I'm assuming that this is a crossover between Whale's direction and theater, as the film set resembles what we might see on stage. There is a scene in Frankenstein where the walls are cut away in a similar manner, thusly relating the similarities to Whale's preference, or perhaps having the same carpenters and set designers between the two films. I want to state that I think films like this truly changed Hollywood and the industry. For better or worse, this was during the start, if not the start, of movie franchises. James Whale, who directed The Invisible Man, also directed Universal's Frankenstein 2 years earlier, and The Bride of Frankenstein 2 years after The Invisible Man. He helped establish this expansion of franchising genre films. We might not see franchises like the Marvel films, Mission Impossibles, or even Blumhouse films today, if not for standout pieces like The Invisible Man. And while I don't want to dive too much into Blumhouse and their Invisible Man from 2020 or compare the two films, I will say that I believe it is a closer approach to the original Universal monster films than something like Tom Cruise and Alex Kurtzman's The Mummy. I don't think the new Invisible Man is anywhere near iconic as the original, but something that a lot of major studios don't seem to understand, and will probably need to understand going forward, is the need to craft small budget, intense P&A one-off films. Blumhouse understands this, and I think Universal Pictures flourished using this model. How about we wrap this up? Would I recommend this film? Yes. Realize that this was released 90 years ago. I think it's amazing that a nearly 100-year-old film still holds up today and is actually more sensible and entertaining than many modern films. I was drawn into the conflict on screen. Claude Rains played an incredible, deranged scientist lusting for power. E. Clive was amazing as Constable Jaffers. I honestly felt that this was a solid film. Perhaps through lines and certain choices could have been changed for better effect, but I really liked this, and it is currently my favorite Universal Monsters film, and part of the reason that this is the first video I'm putting on here. And not just because of E. Clive's impeccable performance as Constable Jaffers, though the man should have won an Academy Award, or all of the Academy Awards, and just all of the awards, just all of them. Give them all to him. Like I mentioned before, I wasn't bored. I didn't feel talked down to as the movie came up with brilliant methods to try and catch the Invisible Man. If anyone has a passing interest in the Universal Monsters world, I think this is a great jumping on point. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Now a final notice for all of you watching out there. You have been lied to. If there's something strange in the neighborhood, if an invisible man is sleeping in your bed, who do you call? Constable Jaffers! Good night, everybody. Grace and peace to you all. Class dismissed.